Today, I'm going to be speaking with Bishal Dutta. Bishal is an award-winning writer-director who's had his films premiere at the Cannes Film Festival and sell to major distributors. He's also a former member of the development team here at Slated and someone I've known for over a decade. His feature film debut, a horror movie called It Lives Inside, hits theaters around the country on September 22nd. Bishal, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
First, I want to talk about the concept a little bit. The film is about an Indian legend, the Pishash, which when I saw the film at South by, I found both psychologically terrifying and terrifying in terms of how you chose to represent it on screen.
The Pishaч doesn't kill you right away. It feeds on you slowly.
What made you want to explore this concept or this creature in a horror film?
So the idea really came from the sense of, I want to do a film about what it's like to try and fit in. What kind of real world mythology can I use to directly target the insecurities of my protagonist, who I knew was going to be this very likable, shy, kind of insecure Indian American girl? And as I was reading about these various mythologies, I read about the Pishash and did a lot of this research, and I realized like this is the perfect antagonist for the film I'm making, both on this kind of the level of physical horror, this raw kind of, nightmarish, this is a true boogeyman, right? And on the level of theme and on the level of what this specific character is going through. It felt like a very perfect match to me.
How do you, choose which themes you're going to draw on, or how do you conceive of that?
I think it was a skill that I really picked up while working at Slated and looking through these scripts, because when you're looking at that many scripts, I think it's not about good or bad, right? It never is about good or bad. There's so much subjectivity. One of the things that you, Greg, taught me very early on is to meet the film on its own terms, to meet the script on its own terms. And I was thinking about, how do I do that? And the sort of most consistent answer for me was theme, and not in some big picture way, in some sort of intellectual way, but really like, what is every scene about in this movie? And is every scene about the same thing at its kind of foundation? And so when I'm writing, I don't know that necessarily I think about the theme right at the beginning. I have a sense of what the conflict is. And the writing process, I think, gives me so much in terms of, I'll write a scene and you mess around with two pieces of dialogue and it's like, oh, that's what the scene is about.
I'm going to shout your praises that in the 5 years that you worked with our development team at Slated, you read over 800 scripts, which is, when I tell people that, it kind of blows their mind. Can you share a bit about the importance of reading other people's screenplays and how that factors into your own work as a filmmaker?
It's truly a part of my filmmaking education that I wish everybody could have. And when people ask me for advice, it's one of the first things I say is like, find access to unproduced screenplays and read as many of them as you can. Try to find a job like mine. I don't think you'll be lucky enough to, but see if you can, because what it gave me was, and again, the most important part of this is the unproduced part, because once you see a film, obviously so many things kind of filter into it and so many screenplays are kind of formatted to the final film. I think what I took away was not necessarily rules, but instincts. And I think when you read such a large volume of scripts, there are these sort of underlying instincts that just pull through. You see them across 10, 15, 20 scripts, and you're like, I like this, or I don't like this. And I think it's the most important and hardest part of filmmaking, is to turn what is kind of this intellectual exercise of what should be into what is.
Extremely well said. This film won the Audience Award at South by Southwest this year. Can you share a little bit about what kind of experience you hope audiences will have with It Lives Inside?
Absolutely. One of my sort of formative horror film going experiences was when the first Conjuring came out. I was in high school, and I went to see it because with some friends, and the whole sort of conversation at school was like, this movie doesn't have any sex, doesn't have any bad language, no blood, but it's rated R because it's so scary, and there was this thing of kids like daring each other to go see it. And then I showed it to my parents and they couldn't get through more than half of it. And I wanted to do a movie that like 15, 16-year-old movie me would have gone to see with like my friends and have that sort of very communal horror experience. And what I felt was that okay, I went through this thing as a high schooler. A lot of people I know, my family, friends went through it, cousins, whatever. And what I realized was, okay, if I can, put it in the language of horror, which is so universal, fear is so universal, then I think that people will have, on one hand, this sort of exceptional time at the movies, laughing and screaming and that kind of like very gratifying theatrical experience, but then they can go home and really think about like, okay, this meant something to me. I felt different before, and how do I feel about it? So it's that kind of layered double experience that I wanted to create with this film.
It does, there is a deep psychological fear that sets in, and I think walking away from the theater, you do sort of have a greater appreciation for your family and your
I hope
close
so.
relationships. Your actors in this movie are incredible. The cast is so insanely talented and they give such a terrific performance. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? How do you approach working with talent? Do you have a philosophy on rehearsal?
I love actors. They make my job so easy. And in this particular film, I just got to work with the most incredible ensemble of people. And it started with Megan Suri, who was our lead, and she was, I think, the very first person I met for the role. And you're not supposed to fall in love with the first person you meet for a role, but it was just, there was a quality to her that I couldn't get past, for this, for this character, which is that, I could see both sides of the character arc, right? I could see her as this sort of very likable teenager at the beginning, a little shy, a little unsure, but then I could also see her as a kind of the action hero at the end of the film. When I'm working with these kinds of actors like Megan and Mohana and Betty Gabriel from Get Out, who is incredible in this film, Nira Bajwa, Vic Sahay, when I'm working with these actors, I feel like I'm getting in the editing room and I'm constantly cutting dialogue. I'm cutting things out that suddenly they're doing something with a look or a gesture that I just cannot, match with a line, right? So I think it's this sort of whittling process for me of I want to put everything on the page so the actors have as much material as they can work with. But when they're really good, like these actors were, I think they're bringing so much visual storytelling. So I'd go in on the day. With all these ideas of you should do this and you should do that, and the actors would just say, "Let me try it," and they try it on the first take. It would be so much better than anything I had anticipated. And to me, it's not necessarily about rehearsal, which is very much a luxury in independent film. It's more about the opportunity to talk about the characters.
It's probably a critical skill set when you think about being a multi-hyphenate where you are a writer and then you have to be a director and then you have to be an editor, and you can't be too precious
Yes.
in relation to each of those other roles.
Well, and to that end, I think it's so much more important that the more, I guess, control and power you have over the film, that you are open. Because I think that the worst thing that can happen, and I forget who said this, but what a shame if the film is only as good as me, right? Like that's there's so many incredible people we get to work with through this process, professionals, creatives. And I think that if if there is an environment where everybody feels like they can bring something creative to the table, a great idea, then it really is such a shame if one person's ego does not allow that, because ultimately who suffers from that? It's the audience, right? Who suffers from a film that isn't the best ideas sort of put into a blender? It's the audience. And what I feel like I owe to the audience at the end of the day is to deliver the best movie possible. So to that end, I think you're absolutely right. That collaborative, sort of point of view, that openness is so important.
You make it sound like a lot of fun. I think a lot of people are going to be antsy to jump into production as soon as they possibly can. Is there anything else? I know you've done a few of these. Are there any other questions that you don't get asked about the film that you'd like people to know or that you'd like to speak about?
Well, the one thing I would say I just love talking about, and I think more people should talk about, is sound.
I heard an interview with Barry Jenkins on NPR, and he said an NYU professor told him sound is half.
Yes. Yes. My God.
Visuals are half the movie. The other 50% is sound.
It's so important, to the point where that sound is half thing resonates with me so much because every time I show one of my horror movies to people for the first time in that first edit, it's never scary. It never scares them. And the answer invariably is to take sound out. On this film, I mean, there's an entire performance being created off screen of the Bishash because it remains, sort of invisible for so much of the film. And so with this movie, because our characters are never quite sure where certain sounds are coming from.
Why are you whispering? It's listening.
We tried to use the full sort of the full width of the theater, the full length of the theater to keep you constantly looking around, and it puts you right there with them. The movie screen can't get any bigger than 70 millimeter, 15 per 143 IMAX, right? You can't go any bigger than that. But there is a certain sonic experience that I think we can continue to innovate on and really incentivize an audience to come to the theater to see a movie. There's nothing like Dolby Atmos, and when filmmakers can really utilize those formats. I feel like that to me is the future of continuing to deepen the audience's relationship with movies.
If you could go back and give yourself advice to at the beginning of this process, or go back and give advice to a younger Bishal Dutta, what advice would you give him?
I think the biggest advice I would give is to work on endurance, is like the weird sort of obstacle, because I had on this film incredible partners that I never felt were in conflict with me. The production process went smoothly, never had like COVID shutdowns, etc. For all intents and purposes, this I feel like was the absolute best version of a first feature for me, and I feel very lucky about that. But consistently, the problem is endurance, and we've been making this movie for close to 3 years now. And there are times where like there were just so many times when people called me and said, "You can relax now, it's over." That's not over. People are like, "You can relax after production." No way. You can relax when the edit is done. No way. You can relax when the movie's done. Now we're going to go test it. You think we can relax at a test screening? And then it's like, it's that thing of really pacing yourself for the entirety of the thing, because I think that there is a tendency in a lot of filmmakers to overwork early on and go, well, let's just hit the finish line. But I don't think until you've made a feature, you understand how far away the finish line is. And I still don't feel like I'm at the finish line. Maybe when the movie releases, we'll get to the finish line. Maybe when it releases on Hulu, we'll get to the finish line. But I think it's that kind of training yourself to go, I'm going to take this one step at a time. I'm also going to enjoy the small victories. We cut a great scene today. That's a victory. I'm going to enjoy that. And learning to go with the ebb and flow of the production rather than seeing it as this kind of consistent sprint.
You can't give better advice than that.
Thank you.
Endurance and learning to celebrate those small victories along the way.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And thank you so much, Bishal, for taking the time to speak with me today. I cannot tell you how excited I am for the film to come out, and for the Slated community and everyone outside of the Slated community to see it and experience it and enjoy it and be unnerved and terrified by it. So thank you so much for taking time to let us a little bit into your process and your journey.
Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.